Welcome everyone in today's webinar, which is hosted by Femmes Women. My name is Dalma Fabian, and I'm a policy officer working on women's homelessness. And Femmes Women is a community of practice that brings together professionals who work towards ending women's homelessness. As the participants are arriving, I just would like to say that we are in the middle of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, which Femmes also joined this year, and we are raising awareness of the link between gender-based violence and women's homelessness. So please follow us on the different social media platform and join in the campaign, and also share your campaign materials if you are participating. So today we have 75 minutes to spend together this afternoon, and our topic is women's safety. This is a very important topic because it's a key, one of the key aspects of women's homelessness is the lack of safety, and women describing that they are constantly at risk of violence and abuse while they are homeless, while they are sleeping rough or staying in homelessness accommodation. We also know that homelessness services are working with the survivors of gender-based violence and with perpetrators on a daily basis. They might be in a couple, they might be survivors or survivors, and or they might be the perpetrator. But services often do not feel trained and equipped in supporting them. So today in our panel, we have three excellent speakers that will introduce the guidance they have developed in their work on to address women's safety and how to support survivors and work with the perpetrators. Both tools that they will be presenting today are results of cross-sectoral work. So they also good practice example of joint working of different sectors. Before we start, just would like to tell you that it's we are recording the webinar, and we will be sharing the recordings with those who registered. And we will, I kindly ask you to use the chat box and introduce yourselves, to say hi. And after the presentations, we will have a question and answer session. So please send your questions in the question box, and the panel will, participants in the panel will answer those questions at the end of the presentation. So I hand over now to Laura Slimani from Fondation des Femmes from France.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share a short presentation. Thank you for having me today in this seminar. Thank you, Dalma, for inviting me. At the moment, I work for the Women's Foundation, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about this, but I used to work for Fédération des Acteurs de la Solidarité, the French shelter organization for the homelessness sector in France. And so I'm really happy to be able to still be in touch with Femmes through my new job that I've had for 2 years now. And so the reason I'm here today is to tell you a little bit about a project that we developed with the Women Foundation, which is called, in French, Un abri pour toutes, a shelter for all women. So toutes in French, is the it's for all, but feminine. And it's a project that is that was initiated by the Women's Foundation, but that included a lot of stakeholders, and I will tell you a bit about this too. Just a few words about the Women's Foundation in France, the Fondation des Femmes. We are 6 years old, so we're still a young foundation, and we were created to try and bring about the means for gender equality in the French society, because we have witnessed that women's rights NGOs have very limited resources on many levels. And there was no foundation in France until then that would help collecting funds from the public and from companies or from philanthropy, and redistribute it to NGOs, to women's rights NGOs. So that's why we were created, and we have 3. I'm realizing that the slide is still not completely in English, but our action is threefold. We support financially NGOs, grassroots NGOs. So we've distributed about 6 million euros to them since 2016. We bring them material support, for example, sometimes shelters or like accommodation, but also just many material things that women in precariousness can need, and legal support. We have a judiciary force of lawyers who help NGOs on all legal matters. This is just a bit about the Women's Foundation. And what we do also is that we lobby to promote more rights and more public mobilization towards women's rights in the French society through reports, recommendations, and projects such as Un Abri pour Toutes, which in the end resulted in recommendations, as I will tell you, and so is included in lobbying part of what we do as the Women's Foundation. The concept of this project was to enable women who live in shelters, who live in accommodation, to experience safety and visibility. The reason why it started is that by talking with homelessness sector professionals, it became with the increased visibility of gender-based violence in society, it appeared that accommodation centers and shelters were massively or were very majoritarily thought for men, with this idea that homeless people are mostly men, and this preconceived idea, because women homelessness is, we know, actually very massive and just different, invisible. And that even though, women started gaining more visibility within homelessness, the homelessness sector, we thought that there was a persistent invisibility of women and a lack of safety that was reported, that is being reported by homeless women who regularly say that they do not go to mixed centers because they fear for their safety there, and who also, sometimes decide to stay outside on the streets or in other accommodations instead of going to these places because they don't feel safe there. And also, the Me Too movement showed that gender-based violence, and especially sexual violence, exists throughout the whole society, and these areas where people live together, for us it seemed important to look at what happened there and how we could tackle these issues also where it's not necessarily visible or said, but still happens. So it was a 4-year project which had 4 phases, and the overall objective was to create, together with professionals who work with homeless people and who work with survivors of gender-based violence, a method and a protocol to ensure women's safety in mixed homelessness centers. So the first phase was a diagnosis on 3 shelters who participated. The second phase was information and coordination. The third one professional trainings. And the fourth phase was studying the spaces. So it's not only the experience of people, but how the way that spaces are organized in the structure can influence positively or negatively gender-based violence and also gender equality in general. So as I said, 3 shelters participated voluntarily, so mixed shelters of different sizes and different types, but all in the Paris area. A diverse team of professionals which gathered on a regular basis. So in this team, you had these 3 the directors of the managers of these 3 centers, some social workers, some of the professionals who intervened during the project, who are trainers on gender-based violence, but also people who work on so urbanists. Sorry, sometimes I don't have the vocabulary in English, so please forgive me or ask me if you don't understand something. And so we met on a regular basis to follow up on the project and to keep track of it and also try and adapt it if necessary, especially with COVID, which was also during the project. So the first phase was an audit of these 3 structures, so interviewed with women who lived there, and it really gave us a better idea, a better understanding of the extent of violence, of gender-based violence that women who live there had or experienced still in these shelters, and the lack of support that they had regarding this situation. So most of the women, I mean, the profile of the women is one with a lot of precariousness, of a lot of mostly a migration background and with street experience. So as we know, which are all factors of greater exposition to gender-based violence. And indeed, this is something that came up in the study, because 93% of the women who were interviewed have had experienced gender-based violence in their life before or during their stay in the shelter. 17% of them said that since they arrived there, they did experience gender-based violence. Mostly gender-based violence in the couple, but also sexual violence came up very high, and mutilations, and all sorts of violence actually were experienced. 18% of them also felt in danger during the study, which is also that I thought was interesting to share. And in most cases, this violence was perpetrated by members of family or husbands. So especially in the past, and especially for women who had a complex migration path, this was the case. Which this audit also questioned, how these questions were tackled or not by the teams and by the NGOs. And 55% of the women said that it was the first time they mentioned ever in their life this violence that they experienced. For 55% of them, sorry. For 86%, social workers in the structure never asked them if it was the case, if they had ever experienced gender-based violence. And 82% believed it was useful to develop actions about this issue. So it's not something that was not present in among the things that they want to be tackled. It's not something that they're not aware of. I mean, they're perfectly aware that they have experienced this violence and that it is not being tackled, is what I meant, what I wanted to show you by showing you the figure. The audit also looked a little bit about how women viewed and evolved in the spaces of the shelters. And you can see in so I'm sorry, I couldn't translate this, an image. But you can see that women felt, so I mean, they feel generally, during the day, they felt, 67%, sorry, of them feel okay during the day moving in the center, but only 44% of them have the same feeling at night, and a majority of them do not feel safe when they move throughout the shelter at night. They also said that the bedroom for them was a very privileged space where they spent most of their time, And 60%, as I just said, avoided moving during the center at night. One of them says in the study that she at night she runs to, when she has to go pee, she runs to the toilet because she's scared of meeting someone who might hurt her. And in mixed yes, and that we also questioned them about what they think about living with men, living together with men, because obviously we also have some non-mixed centers, especially for women who are in these shelters because of gender-based violence. And 84% of them said, I mean, the majority of them were okay with living together with men, but 84% of them did ask for more women-only spaces in the shelters. So even if it's a shelter where everyone lives, women and spaces and times to be dedicated to women only seem to be a priority or something that could be important for them. And for collective spaces, so for instance, the canteen or just recreational areas, they mostly use them for very practical uses and do not stay in these areas longer than they have to. So, they do not use them as socializing areas, for instance, but rather, just to go eat or to go do something practical in this area. But they don't tend to linger or to just stay in these areas, contrary to men, as we will see later. And we also audited social work. We also interviewed social workers and professionals. And so none of these 3 shelters had specific protocols or formalized practices to identify and react to gender-based violence when they occur during the stay of the people. 85% of social workers said that they never had a specific training in their professional training about gender-based violence, and 75% also mentioned that it's a difficult topic for them to mention for different reasons, because they don't know how, because they're afraid that they're going to find out about the situation and not know how to react. So mostly they wanted, they know that it's important, but they feel it's a difficult topic that they're not really well prepared to tackle. So that was there is a specific report about all of these figures and many more, so I can obviously send it to Dalma so that you can have a look at it. I'm sorry though, because it's in French, so but if you have questions, I'm more than happy to answer them too. The second phase, I'm going to go quicker about this because it was basically that we thought that we identified that one of the issues was to inform people within the shelter to inform about gender-based violence, to kind of start creating a culture about gender equality, and to promote messages that would help it. And so it was also to help professional in the same geographical area. You can have a shelter, but also a women's center, for example. And the idea was to for social workers to have sort of a list of people they can call for this type of for this and that type of violence, and a list of professionals, a list of psychologists, and of different professionals they could refer women to when a situation like this occurs, or when they identify a situation of gender-based violence. And it was also to create collaborations, cooperation, to promote equality in the center, for example, information sessions or workshops, events that could happen within the center, but with actors and NGOs that are specialized in gender-based violence issues. And also this phase allowed us to create some tools, a poster specifically that we distributed to this shelter, created and distributed to the shelter. The third phase was to train the professionals who work in these centers on basic training about, because we mentioned that this training didn't happen for most of them. So on training them on how to identify, to understand, to support, and to refer a person who experienced violence. These sessions were directed towards social workers, but there was also an information session for everyone who worked in the center. So even in non-social workers position, but people who I don't have the words, but who take care of the building, for example, and can also be yes, need to also be informed of these issues. And the idea is to develop a shared approach and understanding of gender-based violence beyond prejudices that can exist among everyone, and also yes, to enable the professionals to have the tools necessary to be able to answer or to be able to tackle these situations when they occur. And the fourth phase was a study of the spaces and how these spaces what impact, how the way they're organized can have an impact on gender equality and the feeling and the reality of safety or not of women in these centers. So we worked with an NGO which is called Jean Réville, and it's women who are urbanists and geographers and architects, and so their specialty is to work on these topics of how spaces, public and private spaces, can have an impact on inequalities. And so they also wrote a report about thinking and organizing space for a peaceful and safe mixity in centers and homelessness centers. They went on site and observed the areas, organized workshops with women and men living in the shelters, so that they could also interact and tell a little bit more about the place they live in. What they found out is not very surprising, but I still have a few points laid out there, and you can find more in the report, is that centers tend to reinforce inequality in spaces through control and appropriation by men of collective areas. So because this question of gender is not thought through in the way that they're created, they tend to reinforce the situation that already exists in society, which is inequalities between men and women. They also pointed out the importance of the near environment of the centers for women's safety and for how they especially their ability to go out and back in at late hours of the center, and sometimes the areas around the centers are not felt like safe, and so it's also an issue that needs to be taken into consideration. They also said that the bigger the centers, because I said that there were different sizes of centers who participated in the study, and the bigger they were, the more difficult it is to ensure safety for the people who live there, because it's, they say it makes the center less human, and so it creates a feeling of oppression that is larger for women. They also said the balance between men and women in the shelter is also important, and it's important that, I mean, the more women, the safer. So the more the balance is shifted towards the majority of women, the better it is, the better women feel in the center. It was also something that we found out in the first in the auditing phase. And they recommended also to develop more women-only spaces and times, and also thinking the paths between the shelters and outside. For example, if you have a women aisle where women are living, making sure that they don't have to go through the men aisle or in front of the men's toilet or in front of an area where there's a lot of men, to go to their own area. So these kind of things that need to be thought when building, when it comes to conceptualizing and building the centers. So the conclusions of the project were, there were different tools that were created. We created, together with the Fédération des Acteurs de la Solidarité, the organization I used to work for, this shelter organization for homelessness organizations in France. We created a book or a report of recommendations to professionals of the homelessness sector that I will present. We also lobbied towards public authorities with a specific report and created tools like the sticker that you can see on the left, and that we also made a poster, as I said later. earlier. Sorry. So among the recommendations that we made to the homelessness professionals and created them together with homelessness professionals, of course, is to introduce systematic questioning about gender-based violence when the person first arrives to the center. To introduce also a specific protocol in the whole, so in centers, and also we recommended that this be done at the structure level. So if it's a national organization or regional organization, I mean, this needs to be something that is shared with the whole organization, and especially the headquarters, so that it's well implemented then. To also create specific contact points in every center, so a person that is that takes care of the topic and that is identified by the people living in the shelter as a person who can be talked to, but also someone who organizes the work about this topic and animates it. The word, but can promote this issue internally inside the shelter. Working in network with specialized organizations, with human rights NGOs who can be helpful in training, informing, but also in supporting some of the clients, some of the people who are, some of the women who are experienced or have experienced this violence. Engaging in large professional training of the teams, of the whole teams. I've already talked about it. Putting up information leaflets, like stickers, information leaflets, posters, so that this question of equality is present for everyone every day and all the time, to also create a sort of a culture of equality within the centers, and also having explicit internal rules about gender-based violence, so not only about how violence is forbidden in the center, but also on specifically gender-based violence. And also an important one is creating women-only spaces and times for example, if there's like a living room or a leisure space, you know, be making sure that during the week there is a certain time where it's women only, or making sure that one of these rooms is only for women in the center. And this was also, I mean, this was really put forward as a measure, or like as an action that could empower women to be to feel well in these collective spaces, and to be able in turn to also go into the mixed and to go and stay in the together in the mixed areas. And for public authorities, there's also a report about that I can send you. So, you know, there were many recommendations, but one of our conclusions is that we need more women-only centers too, because about half of the women did ask or did say that they would prefer to be in women-only centers, especially when and because of the violence that they had lived beforehand. So we do still recommend that more of those be created. Integrating gender in project calls as an obligation, not done at the moment, and that it creates this invisibility that we talked about earlier. So we think that it needs to be put into the official documents before a center is created, so that it's taken into account. Thinking about how the spaces outside are organized, and whether they will generate insecurity feelings for women, and insecurity also as such or not, and therefore, you know, really about where these centers are localized, and preferring areas that are animated, so that it's not a problem for women to go in and out of the center. And also to try and make sure that in these mixed centers there are more women than men, or that there's a proportion of women which is big enough that it doesn't make them feel completely insecure. And so these, you know, are the partners that we worked with. So just to show you that there's a variety of them, mostly so NGOs on the top side, and then it's the financial partners of the project on the bottom of the slide. So yes, this is just an overview, but you know, I can also send you these documents where you can find more information. This is the project that I wanted to share with you. Sorry if I was a bit long.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for sharing this a great project with us with very important recommendations. We are a bit tight on time, so I quickly move our next speakers. It's Lucy Campbell from Single Homeless Project and Louisa Steele, sorry, from Standing Together. And the title of the presentation is Supporting Perpetrators and Survivors of Domestic Abuse in Homelessness Settings, New Approaches to create increasing safety and improving outcomes. Lucy and Louisa, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Dalma. Hi everyone, it's lovely to be here today. My name's Lucy Campbell. I work for a homelessness charity in London called Single Homeless Project, or SHP. I'll pass over to Louisa.
Hello everyone, my name's Louisa Steele. I'm the Housing First and Homelessness Project Manager at Standing Together Against Domestic Abuse. Standing Together are a London-based charity that works on building a partnership response to domestic abuse in London and nationally as well.
Great, thanks, Louisa. And so today we're going to be talking about some guidance and training which we developed with a number of other organisations across the sectors, the domestic abuse sector, the homelessness sector and the perpetrator management sector, to really try and better support frontline professionals working in homelessness services. So by homelessness services, we mean the whole range. So maybe that's street outreach for people who are sleeping rough, or night shelters, hostels, housing first projects, etc. And to really try and support them to increase their confidence when confronted with a really challenging issue of trying to support survivors of domestic abuse when their perpetrators are regularly or always around them. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So just before we go on, just to reference the language used in the presentation today. So we're going to be talking about survivors and perpetrators who are experiencing multiple disadvantage. Some people may use the term multiple disadvantage in their areas and some may not. So just to clarify what we mean by that, as it says here, we're referring to people who are experiencing multiple and severe social challenges. So social issues such as homelessness, mental ill health, substance use, physical ill health, etc. And all those challenges are experienced at the same time. So they're co-occurring and they're also mutually reinforcing. So each one is making the other worse and so on. So that's who we're referring to when we talk about people experiencing multiple disadvantage. It's those kind of issues. So what was the need for this guidance? Why did we bring organisations together to look at this problem in the first place? As Dalma mentioned when the session opened, supported housing and homelessness providers are working with survivors and perpetrators of domestic abuse every day. Unfortunately, especially for women experiencing homelessness, it's a pretty universal issue. It's extremely prevalent. And we also know that there are specific issues and risks for survivors who are experiencing multiple disadvantage. So that kind of those issues that we just described, one of which is that they are much more likely to remain in relationships with the perpetrator for a number of reasons, sorry. So the prevalence of the issue was one kind of major factor. And we also did a number of focus groups with homelessness frontline practitioners from different services and different organisations. And what they were telling us was that they were having to deal with these issues every day, but they did not feel sufficiently trained or supported, either in knowing what to do when they were trying to support a survivor, when the perpetrator was always present, and also the other side of that. So if their team or their service was supporting the perpetrator around their issues with homelessness and their other needs, they didn't feel trained or supported to know how to respond when they were witnessing perpetrator behaviour firsthand. And I think it's really important to clarify that the guidance and training that was created is in no way saying that all practitioners in the homelessness sector need to be kind of skilled professional, kind of up to professional standards when it comes to domestic abuse or perpetrator management, you know, it's not safe and it's not appropriate to expect that. But what we did want to do is to create something which made people feel that they had the confidence to do something rather than nothing when confronted with these situations, and to know what to do. Also, as we know, many domestic abuse services are just not resourced to work with survivors who might be experiencing homelessness and other issues. They may not have the capacity to take an outreach approach, for example. They may not be kind of skilled up to deal with the kind of complexities of working with domestic abuse alongside this whole range of other interrelated factors. And again, on the perpetrator side of things, there are some specialist interventions available for perpetrators experiencing these needs, but they are few and far between. So again, really, really kind of hard to come by those specialist resources. And finally, I think really most importantly, just recognising that no one sector has the answer. You know, we don't know what to do about these really complex issues in the homelessness sector. Domestic abuse as a sector often doesn't meet these survivors or reach them. And again, perpetrator management, we're not especially used to working with perpetrators with such high levels of complexity of needs. So what we wanted to do was come together and create a response which was taking into account the skills and expertise and thoughts of all of those sectors collaboratively. So before we go on, I'm just going to play a short film of some of the women that we supported in my last project in London, just talking about their experiences of being homeless and in a couple, and the impact that that had on them engaging with support.
I've never been able to get support whilst I've been with a partner, never. I wouldn't allow it to break away. And that's what I'm doing now.
I've been homeless like on and off since I was 16. I was homeless in Glasgow and then came back down to London, and I was homeless on and off, like hostels, the street. I've had like 3 flats, refugees, and I've had having to move because my ex-partners found out where I was. And me and my ex-partner, we were on the streets together, and if I was going to meet my support worker, like he would say, "Oh, don't go get her. If you're going to get her, you're not going on your own, and I'm coming with you," whatever. So my ex-partner would, like, if he was on the streets, he would hate me going in a hostel or whatever, because like he'd say, "Oh, we're finished then if you're going in to get some help." My partner didn't want any support. Like he'd only like want me and him together, like me and him supporting each other, but it was basically like me supporting myself and him not wanting me to get support.
Me and my partner were using drugs, and because of that, every time he didn't get his drugs, he'd throw me out, so I'd be out on the street. But he'd only take me back when I get money. So yeah, I've been on the street before because of my addiction and being, well, with him really, which is violent, he was, but he died, so. My partner stopped me from getting support. If I had an appointment, he would keep me back from the appointment, and then I'd end up missing it because of his, because of the way we were, like, we were volatile, the pair of us. So, but I don't know, it just left me homeless, like being out on the street for days, sleeping in dustbins, you know, round the back of dustbins and in people's doorways, and it was a horrible experience. My partner struggled because he has an addiction, and he used to stay out on the streets a lot. So I try and help him to get an appointment made, but he wouldn't make the appointment, so, and he ended up dying on the street. Yeah, he was unlucky.
So yeah, some really clear examples of the challenges, and a big thank you to the women there for sharing their stories with us. I'm going to hand over to Louisa now.
Yeah, so, oh. So that was the women there from the service Lucy used to manage, talking about their experiences and how isolated and controlled they were by their partners, and how their partners blocked them from support. And I suppose what we wanted to do with this guidance was, and one of the first things we did actually, was speak to professionals working with these women about what it was like to work with a survivor who was being blocked from support, what it was like to have to interact with the perpetrator, and their fears and concerns around that. So the first thing people said was kind of fear that they were colluding with the perpetrator's behaviour in some way. So I knew that if I challenged his behaviour, he wouldn't allow her to come to the housing appointment with me. I'm always trying to put her needs first, but in doing so, I feel I had to ignore his behaviour. And, you know, professionals feeling really quite conflicted about that. Fear of increasing risk to the survivor or of losing engagement with the survivor. So they were saying things, professionals were saying things like, if you give a statement to the police and he goes to court, he won't let me see you again. And if we worked kind of in the traditional safe approach, we just wouldn't reach the survivor at all. Also, you know, the very real risk that perpetrators present to professionals as well. So having those conversations where you're saying, I'm here to support you, but that behaviour is not okay, and it's really intimidating sometimes. And just generally the challenges that professionals have around supporting perpetrators and not having the confidence or skills or knowledge to be able to do that, and how difficult it is to provide, you know, positive regard and support to perpetrators when you know what they're doing to their partner. So it's really difficult to feel positive regard towards him when I know what he's doing to her and I can't challenge it. So this is what we started with for this guidance. So in terms of who the guidance for, we sat down and we had a think, and we kind of took advice from our focus groups and feedback from our initial roundtable that kind of kicked this guidance off. So the guidance is for professionals supporting survivors in homelessness support settings. As Lucy said earlier, that's outreach teams, supported accommodation, floating support teams, housing first services, where the perpetrator is often present. So we know in homelessness support settings, professionals are more likely to be working with survivors who are still in relationships with their perpetrators and have contact with the perpetrator as well. As a result, professionals just supporting perpetrators in homelessness support settings as well. So they might not see the survivor, but aware they're working with somebody who's a perpetrator. And obviously in homelessness support settings, there might be services where they are actually supporting both in one service, survivor and perpetrator. And we also wanted to make some wider recommendations for organisational leads and commissioners. So the guidance, the aims of the guidance are fourfold. To support practitioners to understand the ways in which domestic abuse intersects with multiple disadvantage and identify when abuse is occurring. So first of all, you know, when you are working with or when you're supporting a perpetrator, or you're potentially supporting a couple, a perpetrator and a survivor, it's really important that you're able to do that assessment to be able to identify those signs of domestic abuse in the first place. Obviously, we don't want to make assumptions about people's relationships being abusive as a first port of call, but it is really important that staff are skilled up to be able to spot those signs. Have increased awareness of perpetrator behaviours and increased understandings of the motivations behind perpetrator behaviour. So I suppose just giving professionals in homelessness settings, better understanding around what drives that, so that they understand and they know to keep the responsibility for the abuse with the perpetrator. That leads on to 3, know what to do and say to make sure they're not colluding, that they are keeping that responsibility for the abuse with the perpetrator, and kind of gently reinforcing that with the survivor too. And feel confident to work in partnership with specialist services and other agencies to hold perpetrators to account and keep survivors safe as well. Multi-agency response is always crucial.
Thanks, Louisa. So I know we're really short of time. I think everything's running a little bit behind today. So we're really going to whiz through just a couple of examples from each of those 3 sections that the guidance covers. But at the end, there are links to the guidance and all of the other resources related to our talk today. So do have a look at them if you'd like to learn more. So firstly, we talk about professionals, as Louisa said, who are supporting just the survivor, but there's always the perpetrator around. So the guidance and training talks about having 2 workers, whether they're from the same team or getting someone in from another service, to try and have a kind of a joint approach to all interactions and trying to kind of have 2 separate conversations, even if a couple won't be separated, to try and just give that survivor that tiny little bit more space. Really essential to link perpetrators into support services themselves. The guidance talks a lot about this. One of the major challenges and barriers is that there's a lot of, well, an increasing amount of emphasis on specialist services for survivors in homelessness spaces. But if the perpetrator's basic needs aren't also met, it's much more likely that the perpetrator will increase their control and try and block the survivor from their own support services, as you heard from the woman in that video. So it's really so important that the perpetrator is getting their needs met as well. And also validating the survivors' experiences of their relationship. So there is so much research and lived experience which tells us about why especially women experiencing homelessness do enter into and maintain relationships within their homelessness circumstances. Often it's seen as a protective factor compared to the kind of multiple unknown risks that they might be facing, for example, if they're sleeping on the street. And some couples experiencing homelessness have been together for many, many years. And so they do have loyalty, they might have shared children. And so even though it can feel very uncomfortable for practitioners, it's really essential that we recognise how the survivor feels about both the positives and negatives in their relationship. So I'm not going to read out these examples, but the training and guidance offers a number of kind of practical tips and kind of conversational openers to try and speak to survivors who maybe aren't ready to disclose that they're experiencing abuse, may not even recognise that what they're experiencing is abuse, and certainly don't want to be hearing language around violence and abuse, but just some kind of gentle conversational openness to start to think about healthy relationships and maybe the disparity that they're experiencing in their own relationships between what they might be experiencing from their partner and what they might be hoping to experience from their partner. So lots of kind of practical tips in there. I'll hand over to Louisa for touching briefly on working with perpetrators experiencing homelessness.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. And this is definitely not my field of expertise. And I think we weren't trying to create guidance that was based on that. It's not really what it was about. But just a few, I suppose, steps for how to approach it. Now, the challenge, many homelessness services will be working with perpetrators and not really feel they have those competence and skills. And I suppose a key message of the guidance is that we can be trauma informed, we can still, support a perpetrator around their basic needs and their experience of their trauma, their substance use, their mental health issues. In one hand, but then with the other hand, we need to make sure we're still seeing the perpetrator's choice to use abusive and violence behaviour, and we're keeping the responsibility and accountability with them as much as possible. And again, I'm not going to read those out, you'll have the slides, but just a few kind of tentative, gentle ways, if you have a relationship with the perpetrator, and you've kind of assessed the risk, to be able to start a conversation about that behaviour and what it looks like. Over to you, Liz.
Oh, thanks. I thought you were going to say something else. And just very quickly, the third section, as we said, looks at services or teams that are supporting both the survivor and the perpetrator. So maybe that's an outreach service that are going out onto the street to meet a couple and trying to house both of them, or maybe it's a hostel where both survivor and perpetrator are living. And the real challenge of that, as it says here, is how to maintain boundaries around the abuse that's happening and safety for the survivor, whilst also acknowledging that they are a couple and that's how they want to be seen. And also another major challenge that we face in London is a real lack of provision for housing couples generally, but especially when there is known domestic abuse, service providers just not wanting to take on that risk in their buildings of something potentially happening. The result of that being that couples can end up spending longer and longer on the streets and deteriorating even further. So the guidance talks about the fact that the first really important thing to remember is professionals should not go in by trying to split up that couple and trying to separate that couple, because what we know again from research and from lived experience of survivors is that can only increase the risk. It means it's much more likely that survivors are going to try and exert more control over the survivor and remove them from their support completely. So it talks about not doing that. Then it gives some best practice tips around what we can do in this really challenging situation. So best practice tips around each individual having their own named worker, but the workers then communicating with each other and presenting a really united front when joint working, especially when it comes to responding to the behaviours of the perpetrator. So having a really firm line, as Louisa said, we can take a trauma-informed approach to working with that person, but holding the line that any kind of violence or abuse is unacceptable and kind of taking an organisational response to that. Holding separate conversations, appointments and multi-agency meetings for each of the couple, but also acknowledging that they are a couple and holding those spaces together for them as well if that's what they want.
And Lucy, can you send them some information on TAMS as well? We can probably share some information on that.
Yeah, that's a multi-agency approach known as Teen Around Me, which I can share some information on. And finally, we looked at developing a multi-agency risk sharing framework for housing couples where there is known domestic abuse. It's something that we've been piloting in London for the last couple of months, and we'll be releasing new guidance from Standing Together, hopefully in January, around how to support housing providers to kind of take on that risk but in a shared way so that no one is held personally accountable for what might go wrong, and also kind of getting a collective sense of risk management and problem solving and trying to work collectively to do the safest thing for the couple in any given scenario. So we're really short of time, so I'm going to wrap this up, but we did have the training independently evaluated. We had some really, really positive findings back from that evaluation. So 100% of delegates would recommend the training to others. Positive impact was demonstrated across all of the learning outcomes. And the participants really valued something which was created for them. So not talking about generic domestic abuse, not talking about perpetrator management generically, but really thinking about the complexities of the work that we all do in homelessness settings and how that feels and looks different. And there's links here in the presentation, which we'll send around to the guidance, to a webinar that we did on this earlier in the year, and also the evaluation report as well. So if you're interested, please do have a look. And thank you very much. That's all from us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Lucy and Louisa. It's for your presentation. It looks great and also very much like the title of confidence in complexity, because it talks about, for me, it talks about the staff being confident in supporting women in complexity, but also the confidence is also important when supporting women and empowering them, because actually in a situation of domestic abuse is that kind of confidence is undermined and the self-esteem is undermined. So great, thank you so much for all of you. I think these are really important resources and tools that you've been sharing this afternoon. We already got very demands for sharing the resources and the materials that you mentioned, the posters, the toolkits. I think they are all could be very useful for many of our members. As I'm waiting for the participants to send their questions, I was thinking just to ask what has been the feedback from the frontline staff, but also from service management when you were sharing your tools and guidances? How did they find it, and how did they manage to embed it in the organization?
Is that for us or for Laura? Sorry.
I think for all of you, but Lucy, you can start.
Okay, I'm happy to start. So as I said, so the pilot findings were really positive. So as I said, I think there just wasn't any like resource which was specifically about this context before. So I think practitioners just found it helpful to feel heard about how complex these situations were. In the kind of full training package that we deliver, we have a number of video clips of survivors talking, but also frontline professionals talking. And some of the feedback was that it just felt really reassuring to staff teams to feel that they weren't alone in not knowing what to do and feeling underconfident. And I think that's really positive. I think in terms of organizational change, there's so much more work to do, because obviously frontline practice is only one element that can only go so far. You know, those professionals need to be supported by organizations that have a really robust understanding of these issues and a really robust response. So for example, one of the big issues that we have if a couple is housed together is if an incident happens and the perpetrator is evicted to the streets. Often what happens is the survivor just follows him, so they both lose their accommodation. So trying to think with kind of organizational leads about policy, and is there another way to manage those situations? For example, could we use the criminal justice system as a kind of consequence, but not mean that the perpetrator had to lose their home? Unless obviously the survivor wants them to lose their home, that's a separate thing, but it's not often the case. So yeah, trying to kind of weigh up these really difficult risks about how to manage domestic abuse, but also not making people homeless, because actually what we know is the more survivors and perpetrators are driven out of services, the less disclosures there's going to be, the less staff are able to kind of support and intervene. So in terms of organisational change, that's the kind of next step, I think. And as I mentioned very briefly, the piece of work, which again, Louisa and I have been involved with a big range of organisations nationally, is to try and provide organisations and commissioners with some more kind of support and guidance about how we may be able to make those difficult decisions together, because yeah, there's a long way to go.
Yeah, I was just going to back that up from what Lucy said. So standing together, we have a national domestic abuse and housing policy and practice group that's standing together, my organisation chair, which brings together housing, domestic abuse and homelessness practitioners from across the country. As part of that work, we do have a separate subgroup that focuses on perpetrators, and we got national perpetrator, survivor and homelessness practitioners together to create these new kind of recommendations. And I know that there's guidance coming out of everyone's ears, but we've tried to be really, really clear and practical around how organisations should be responding to, and how organisations should be supporting their staff to respond as well. It was the natural lead on from this piece of work. So we'll be more than happy to share that when that's finalised, which should be very early in the new year.
Yes, I mean, I can only agree with the importance of organizations as a whole taking this issue into consideration at a very high level, and so that it kind of trying to find the word, trickles down. Trickles down on the whole, you know, on all of the centers and on all of the professionals who who work, and so that also they feel supported when they report issues, when they need advice, when they, you know, so that they have the tools that they need, and that we don't put them in difficult situations. So yes, this is important. Regarding well, for us, I mean, the experimentation really happened in 3 different shelters, and the reaction of professionals was different in each of them, because it was different contexts. What we found is that where there was already one or several people who had an understanding of gender-based violence and an interest for the topic, then it worked really well, because she played a role of promotion of the project within the team, and you know, when there was someone inside who was kind of pushing the project, then it worked really well, and kind of, yeah, it did trickle down on the whole team. It was more difficult in some other places, especially where there was changes in the management or within the organization, where there was within the centers. I mean, I don't know if it's the case in your countries, but in France, many of them, there's a lot of turnover because of precariousness, also of the jobs as social workers, etc. And so the turnover didn't make it easy to promote new practices and to build new ways of working, because obviously you have to start again the training and the explanations, etc. every time someone comes in, because it's not something that happens everywhere. You know, it's quite specific. So yeah, I think that the structural issues of the sector can also sometimes come in contradiction with implementing these new practices, and it's also a challenge. And also, maybe I will add that at the headquarters level, which we also had discussions with one of the organizations, I think they were voluntary to do the project. So I mean, they did have an idea that, you know, there was something to be done, but they really were shocked at the figures, and the first report that I showed you the figures of, they were pretty, you know, shocked. And so I guess that it did create a first awareness level that probably needs to be deepened now.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the similar numbers, there are similar numbers in other countries as well, and we hear it from other services as well, that challenge. I also really think that it's very important that this report on this guidance brings forward the issue of working with couples, which is often ignored in services, or in some services couples are not accepted neither, and then it also isolates women. And as it was described by the testimonies in your presentation, that also quite important aspects. And I think services there also need to be more equipped so that they can work with couples as well. I was just wondering, as I'm waiting for more questions from participants, is that there are often domestic abuse, gender-based violence trainings available in homelessness services, but they are often delivered by specialist women organizations that don't necessarily know the sector, and don't necessarily work with those issues that you mentioned in your presentation, those overlapping, interlinked issues. So, like, my question is that how, in your experience, how these can be tailored, these trainings can be tailored to the sector, and what approach would you recommend that in other countries, the services who want to improve safety for women, what approach do they take to these trainings? What would your advice be?
That's a really good question. I think the way we approached it, so Standing Together is a specialist organisation, and you know, I believe that specialist domestic abuse organisations are best placed to deliver training around domestic abuse. Specialist women's organisations hold so much skill and knowledge around it. But you're quite right in that sometimes, due to resourcing issues, they don't, or how can they be expected to know the ins and outs and how that might need to be tailored for homelessness support settings where people have multiple disadvantages. So I think it's kind of like Lucy was saying earlier on, that partnership working is so key between the women's specialist domestic abuse sector services and agencies and the homelessness kind of sector support agencies. I think that cross exchange of knowledge, skills, ideas, even we call them shadowing opportunities, where you have a group of, maybe we call them in the UK, independent domestic violence advocates, or advisors who do that specialist domestic abuse work, going into, you know, working with an outreach team or going into a hostel for some time, and the other way around. So project workers in a hostel or outreach workers, you know, maybe going into a refuge or supporting the work of the women's specialist organisation. I think that's so incredibly key to creating training that is, and training and resources and support that meets the needs of this group of survivors and women. I know, Lucy, in your old service, you had an advocate, a women's specialist advocate within your, co-located within your team, and that's something that worked quite well, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think often it's kind of going beyond training. Like Louisa said, it's this idea of working literally together in the same office, kind of co-locating people. That's when you learn every day, and you know, if you've got to make a referral and you want to get the domestic violence specialist to maybe check your language and support you to do that, and it kind of slowly upskills a whole team, and vice versa as well. Because I remember when many years ago, before we did this guidance, I commissioned some perpetrator training for my team, because we didn't know how to respond to all these perpetrators in homelessness settings, and I was giving them real life scenarios and they just didn't know what to do with them, because they hadn't worked with perpetrators who had that kind of complexity of needs. And so they kind of like, well, we really need to work with you to develop something, because we don't necessarily have the answers to this. Oh, sorry, my doorbell. So yeah, I think co-location alongside training is a brilliant way to kind of really share specialisms.
Yeah, I mean, I can only go in the same way as you did. It's I mean, our approach, so we acted first as a specialized organization, but we obviously tried to work directly with our topic. You know, we also advocate for more specialized housing for women who have experienced domestic abuse or other forms of gender-based violence. And for us, it's also a big part of the problem and of the issue. So that today the situation is that many women, many couples, but also many women find themselves in these shelters where, with other men who are, for some of them, who are, for some, we do need to tackle this situation too, and you know, therefore we need these specialized organizations and these generalist organizations to work together. This was the whole project was built this way from the beginning, and this is also why the guidances and the recommendations that we made, we built them together with the national homeless organization in France, so that we would have more legitimacy also towards social workers, because we know that if it comes only from a specialist organization, it's not going to be perceived the same way. But we also know that the specialization is needed for everyone to kind of gain in terms of skills and understanding of these issues. and also towards public authorities. For us, it was important to show that we can work together and that we actually share the same views on some of these topics, because I don't know if it's the case in your country, in the UK, but in France, you know, sometimes there can also be a game of public authorities to try and, instead of allowing and enabling everyone to work together, to try and put people in competition for who is going to open the next center, or, you know, these kind of topics. So I think it's and sometimes also going towards one approach rather than the other, etc. So we think that the best way to overcome this is also to work together, understand that we don't have the same approaches on everything, but we can complement each other, and it's you know, and be better this way.
Yeah, 100%.
Great. And I think our webinar is coming to an end soon. I'm reading the chat box, and people are happy, and they found your presentations inspiring, and they are thankful for the resources. I would also like to join in and thank you for all of you for presenting your work with and sharing your work with us. I will also share the presentations and the slides and the resources in an email, in a follow-up email with you. For those of you who haven't not joined yet, please send me an email and join the Femmes Women network. And thank you so much again. And we will continue with the series of webinar next year as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks so
Bye-bye.
much, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.